Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Speaking at Asia's premier security meeting, the Shangri-La Dialogue, Chinese Defense Minister Wei Fenghe talked about China's vision for regional order and stressed China's resolve for peace and stability. Earlier, his U.S. counterpart, Lloyd Austin, explained the next steps for the U.S. Indo-Pacific Strategy. The two also had a face-to-face meeting at the conference. So what are the takeaways out of the dialogue, and how different are the Chinese visions and the U.S. strategies for the region? What does that mean for the future of Asia-Pacific region? And to discuss these issues and more, I'm glad to be joined by Brian Berletic, a geopolitical analyst and former U.S. Marine, Professor Robert Kelly from the Department of Political Science of Pusan National University, and Dr. Zhao Hai, Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Okay, Chinese Defense Minister Wei Fenghe talked about the Chinese vision for this region. So Zhao Hai, I want to have your opinions and your takeaway of his speech. What's the Chinese vision for this region?
Well, I think it's very clear that recently President Xi Jinping talked about global security initiative. And I think Wei Fenghe's speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue is an expansion and detailing of the content of this global security initiative, and talk about the regional security infrastructure and how regional security should be maintained and improved. And China, number one, reiterated the importance of peace and prosperity in the region and China's role in it. And also China has also emphasized that China is against any division of the region, and particularly into different camps and having one party fighting against another. So China wants the region to maintain a common security and maintain common prosperity. And number three, China reiterated that it's very important that Taiwan issue should not be used to destabilize regional peace, and China will resolutely defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity and fighting to the end if challenged. So I think his message in collection, everything is about this region moving forward, particularly after the COVID-19 and after the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. This is increasingly important for the region to continue forward with its own inherent security agreements among parties involved, and should fend off or defend against any danger of dividing the regions and inciting potential conflict in the region.
Mm-hmm. Well, Robert, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin also talked about the U.S. basically vision or the next steps for the Indo-Pacific strategy. So what's his message?
Sure, I think the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy has sort of increasingly become clear in the last few years, and I'm not really sure that a great deal has changed since the Trump administration began to take a more hawkish turn on China. It's going to emphasize a lot of things like freedom of navigation, which is something that the Chinese are going to become upset about. There's going to be a lot of sort of oblique hinting about Taiwan. It's increasingly clear that the Biden administration doesn't believe that strategic ambiguity is worth the downside costs anymore. There's going to be a growing emphasis on the Quad. The Quad, I'm not quite sure yet how to read the Quad. Maybe it's sort of like an embryonic version of NATO or something like that. But I mean, it's fairly clear. Yeah, I mean, there's sort of a discussion about how serious actually the Quad is going to be. But I mean, it's fairly clear that the Biden people take this sort of autocracy versus democracy sort of thing fairly seriously, and they're sort of reading that onto Ukraine, and they're going to read it onto East Asia. I don't think that means the United States wants conflict with China. Obviously, I think what the United States really wants actually in East Asia is the status quo. I think the status quo is actually tilted, broadly speaking, towards the U.S. alliance structure. And so my sense is the Americans are actually not going to make any kind of first moves. But I mean, I don't think the Biden administration is going to sort of accept, I don't know, sort of Chinese hegemony over Taiwan or the South China Sea. I think those are the big flashpoints in the future. I'm not really sure that Shangri-La has moved that debate very much. I think it's good that the two sides are talking. It's better than not, but I'm not really sure if the flashpoints have actually been in any way really sort of altered by the last few days.
Okay, Brian, you are based in Thailand. So tell us, what are the regional countries, in their views about this? Basically, we're talking about the China-U.S. relationship, in particular, their interaction in this region.
I have been in Thailand just about my entire adult life. I've watched the region transform. I've watched the role of China grow in a very positive way. I've seen the way China has helped other nations develop, build infrastructure the West was never going to help them develop. I've watched trade and relations and ties grow and stability increase in this region. But I've also watched a backlash, the US trying to undo this, trying to get into the middle of all of it. And I just think, just consider the fact that this is billed as Asia's premier defense summit, and the United States is not even located anywhere in Asia. And the first plenary meeting is centered around the US Secretary of Defense. I think it's very telling about what this is really about. It's about US hegemony. It's trying to maintain itself in the face of a growing, not just China, but a growing Asia that is coming up with China, and the way they want to assert themselves and their own interests first and foremost over the interests of a nation basically on the other side of the planet.
Well, with that said, obviously, Zhao Hai, the U.S. has, clearly has its interest in this region, Asia Pacific. We're talking about economically, in terms of security, also. But when it comes to the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, the Chinese side seems to be very much upset about that. There's criticism, obviously, from the Chinese defense minister, saying that the strategy is, being an inner circle to coerce countries in the region for the sake of the U.S. own interests in the name of, for example, safeguarding free navigation. Tell us, what's the Chinese side issue with the Indo-Pacific strategy?
Yeah, so first of all, the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy is nothing new. It's a continuation of the pivot to Asia from the Obama administration. This continuation is speaking loud about the US attention in the region, which is to move more strategic asset into the region and try to contain China. And that's China's perspective that the US is very much worried about the influence of China in the region and try to keep it down. And secondly, right now, during the Biden administration, the core of this so-called Indo-Pacific strategy is to enhance its strategic presence, and particularly alliance system in the region. And therefore, it's, from Chinese perspective, it's a grouping or a group of countries that reflect the US strategic will. And with that tightening small group of nations coming together and stressing the so-called US rules, it's no longer as advertised an open and free Indo-Pacific. It's closed and divided Indo-Pacific. And that's what China is worried about, because from China's perspective, without a solidarity and unity in the region, there will be potential conflicts, and that those conflicts could develop into wars in the future. So in order to maintain security and protect prosperity in the region, it's better that the US create a more inclusive network in Asia, and particularly talk directly with China to resolve differences, instead of organizing countries into US orbit and trying to increase its military presence in the region and create a race, armed race, and other security races in the region, endanger the internet and the space, and making more and more gray zone conflict in the region. And I think that's destabilizing, and that's not in the interest of both the United States and China. And that's pretty much what General Wei Fenghe stated during the Shangri-La Dialogue.
Well, Robert, based on your understanding, what's the essence of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, and how is it different from, say, previous pivot to Asia strategy?
Yeah, I agree with my predecessor there, that I think there's a fair amount of continuity. I think the big missed opportunity on the American side has been to fill out the pivot as more than just a military swing, right? This emphasis on sort of the movement of assets, particularly for the Navy. There was an effort under the Obama administration to add the TPP, to add sort of a trade framework, to sort of give this thing something of a sort of like social or cultural, economic sort of end to it, right? There was sort of a suggestion that maybe Americans would start learning Chinese in high school instead of Spanish and things like that. All of that really sort of fell apart. And it really has just become sort of the rebalancing, particularly of the US Navy towards the region. I think that's unfortunate, because I think it sends the signal, which we have often discussed in this show, that it looks like containment, right? And my hope has always been sort of that the United States would actually make a greater commitment to the Asia Pacific, where it wouldn't just be about aircraft carriers. But that's really I think, what is happening, and that's unfortunate. I think the Biden administration particularly faces challenges at home in adding more to the Indo-Pacific strategy beyond just the military wing, because the Biden administration's own domestic coalition is pretty hostile to trade. That is to say that Biden, has traditional roots sort of on the Democratic left in America. That means unions, what's left of them. And then they're fairly protectionist. They don't really believe in trade with China a great deal, right? And so I don't think there's really much room for the United States to add much of a trade benefit or basis to the strategy. So it's basically going to be the Quad, right? I mean, that's sort of the short answer to a long question, right? It's basically the Quad, which means a sort of knitting together of the biggest states in the region. It'll take a lot of time, but the biggest states in the region that are concerned about Chinese goals, particularly inside the first island chain.
Well, Brian, as Robert said, basically the Indo-Pacific strategy is about the Quad, which consists of the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia. Obviously, China is not part of that, and China also mentioned about this, this Indo-Pacific strategy that might affect this centrality of ASEAN states, of the rule of ASEAN. I mean, traditional rule that the ASEAN is in the driver's seat to drive the development of this region. What do regional countries view on this U.S. strategy?
I think the idea of ASEAN centrality, this is about the U.S. creating a united front against China. So the Quad, and in addition to that, a unified ASEAN that they would like to turn against China. Unfortunately for the U.S., leaders, the people here in the region, they want to do business with the U.S. and China. China is the largest trade partner for most of the nations in this region. The U.S. is an important export market, not so much imports. So there's always going to be this gradual process of the region getting closer and closer to China. It's a matter of proximity. It's a matter of China having a larger population, a larger economy, a larger industrial base. And just as others have said, the U.S. is focused primarily on military matters and interfering and coercing nations, trying to put a divide between a nation, say Thailand, for example, and China, which Thai people don't want. They want to do business with both. So it's a self-made problem that the U.S. has, and they continue to make it worse with this very obvious. It's very obvious that it's a containment strategy.
Well, Zhao Hai, obviously, when the U.S., and other countries, when they talk about, say, free and open, the Indo-Pacific strategy, obviously it's not open. At least it's not open to China. And if it is partially open to some of the ASEAN countries, then there's a possibility, let's say, to divide the ASEAN unity, ASEAN centrality, etc. That's probably why China is upset about this strategy. Could be divisive, could sometimes, probably force other countries to choose side between China and the U.S.
Well, it's already very divisive, because if you look at the proposed IPEF, already the U.S. is asking 7 ASEAN countries to join, leaving Laos or Cambodia and Myanmar outside of it. So I think in order to uphold ASEAN centrality, it's very important to treat ASEAN as a whole and respect those countries as a group. So I think continue to pushing this idea of Indo-Pacific strategy, calling it open and free, is misleading and mistaken, because at this point, with military alliance and also a very not inclusive, actually exclusive IPEF, you have the US leading a very divisive region and asking countries, even coercing countries to take sides. Even though, I mean, it's interesting, every time when Secretary Blinken and other US officials talk about the Indo-Pacific strategy, they always say, oh, it's open and free. However, every time they move forward with one initiative after another, you can see the name list of countries that are not inclusive. And China in particular has been excluded from this initiative, and the US is making sure that those initiatives, for instance, IPEF is actually aimed at China's Belt and Road Initiative. And also the Indo-Pacific military strategy is aimed at China's military buildup, so particularly at Taiwan. And the US recently talking about reviving the military bases throughout the region, particularly along the first island chain. So put this all together, it's very clear that at least some strategists in the US, particularly in the White House right now, is trying to revive the Cold War in the region. And they're looking at what's happening in Europe and trying to imitate everything from Europe and move that towards the Asia Pacific, and making and linking these two regions together, just like during the dialogue, they link Ukraine issue with Taiwan issue and trying to globalize NATO. So I think that's inherently dangerous to the regional peace and security.
Well, Brian, Zhao Hai mentioned several issues here, Taiwan issue, the NATO expansion into Asia, let's say, and also this, basically, forcing countries to choose sides. From the regional countries' point of view, obviously, they would, as you said, they would love to, continue to do business with China, continue to do business with the U.S. The U.S. presence here is not a problem, but are they all somehow prepared for a new Cold War, like for new confrontation between the two countries?
I think they would like to avoid that as much as possible. I thought it was interesting that the United States and many people at this dialogue were, talking about sovereignty, preserving sovereignty, talking about Ukraine, how Russia has violated Ukraine's sovereignty, and then in the same breath, talking about we don't recognize Taiwan's independence, but we're going to ship them weapons in contradiction to Beijing's wishes. We're going to interfere politically. We're going to support the government there. They're doing exactly to China what they just accused Russia of doing to Ukraine. And just as the Chinese defense minister said, let's look at the context. What happened in Ukraine before February 24th, 2022? Who actually created that situation? And just as you said, they're trying to move all of that here into Asia. They're trying to link it all together. It's interesting how they have the Quad, and if you look at a map, it's at the outer edges of the region, and then AUKUS. These are nations that aren't even in the region. The U.S. in North America, the U.K. in Europe. I think it's very clear that this is a continuation of Western primacy over Asia. They're trying to continue its primacy over Asia, and they're finding it very hard to find nations in this region interested in this divisive, destructive process, so that they're going further and further out looking for allies.
Mm-hmm. Well, Robert, seems there is, at least from Chinese point of view, there is a concern about the expansion or the influence of NATO. For example, probably, Japan and South Korean leaders will join even the meeting of NATO at the end of this month. And, NATO secretary talked about their interests like in Asia. But this is, for China and for some Asian countries, this is troublesome. NATO is a military organization. NATO is not doing investment or trade with Asian countries.
Yeah, I don't actually think that NATO has any serious interests in East Asia. I would disagree with that strongly. I think the general concern in South Korea and Japan is to sort of restore the linkage with the United States and with the West that was really sort of shaken during the Trump period, when it was very clear that Donald Trump wasn't particularly interested in U.S. allies, and particularly South Korea and the United States began to drift very widely apart. And it's also some of it is because of Ukraine, because the United States is looking for support on the Ukraine issue outside just the West. And so the United States has sort of pushed its democratic Asian allies up a little bit on this. The South Koreans particularly had to sort of be pushed into Ukraine a little bit, whereas Japan came on pretty quickly. But I don't actually think that it means that there's any kind of meaningful interest in NATO actually in expanding out here. Actually, in fact, I would actually argue the other way. I would argue that America's allies in Asia have actually sort of been rather complacent on China and really sort of looked the other way. The Germans, particularly on the trade relationship. This is one of the reasons why you're getting the Quad, I think, because the United States perceives that there is no sort of community of democracies. People may remember that from a few years back. We're going to have sort of this community of democracies, this global NATO, and that just didn't go anywhere because a lot of European states just don't want to get pulled into a tug of war between the U.S. and China in the same way that Southeast Asia doesn't want to get pulled in either. The real core of the issue is the United States and Japan, right? That's really sort of the core of the Quad, right? If the Chinese can sort of, get Japan to sort of agree to Chinese hegemony in the region, it's over, right? So the real core of the relationship is U.S.-Japan on one side and China on the other. And to a certain extent, then in the future is whether or not India will swing over also, right? It'd be nice if Australia is a part of this and the rest of it, but it's fairly small and far away. The really core issue is the U.S. and Japan on one side, and then India's future course right, in the next 20 years. And it's just not really clear that India wants to fully line up with the United States, right? They've always been sort of like very, very half-half on the Quad. So I wouldn't really worry about NATO and a lot of this other stuff. It's really the big issues are the US, Japan, and India, and whether or not that relationship will really tighten up and there actually be sort of like really deep military engagement with, particularly with India. And I don't see that happening, actually. I think China's actually got a lot of room here to sort of push wedges between these partners, if that's its concern, if containment is its concern.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Zhao Hai, you also mentioned about Taiwan, as one of the, if not the prime issue in terms of security between China and the United States. Tell us, what does Taiwan mean to China?
Well, let's say 10 years ago, a long time ago, if you go to these dialogues, there won't be a lot of talk about Taiwan, particularly in a present danger sort of sense of the issue. And right now, it's getting more and more a very sort of dangerous issue at hand, and people are worried about increasing tension across Taiwan Strait. So I think Taiwan, very importantly for China, is a core national interest. China has 3 core national interests, and Taiwan is one of that. And to maintain sovereignty and territorial integrity, and for China to maintain its national identity, it cannot lose the unification process, and particularly cannot allow Taiwan to go independent. So on that issue, I think recent exchange between U.S.-China made U.S. side understand that more and more, and making that very clearly from the Chinese perspective. So I think that's why after the U.S. State Department changed its fact sheet, and then it changed back. And during Blinken's China strategy speech, Blinken emphasized that, again, the United States does not support Taiwan independence. I think that's the bottom line. That's very important because that's the foundation for U.S.-China relations. And that's the foundation of East Asia, West Pacific peace and security. So based on that, I think we need to move forward with more crisis management process between US and China, making sure that no sides can move on this issue that will disturb or undermine the security and peace and security in this region. And recently, I think a lot of the activities taken by the US side is very destabilizing, including changing the mode of defense on Taiwan and asking Taiwan to change, actually, increase its own so-called strategy, the unbalanced strategy, or I don't know, basically increasing civilian or military defense on the islands. And also they ask Taiwan to learn from the cases, the experience from Ukraine and change its military strategy. And also selling more weapons to Taiwan and even providing specific training for Taiwan military. So I think this upgrading of military relations between the United States and Taiwan is actually forcing China's hands and making the region more and more dangerous in terms of unintended consequences created by this environment. So I think moving forward, if the US is really serious about setting up guardrails for US-China relations, making sure it does not veer off from the current status and slipping more and more deeper into conflicts, I think, or confrontational status. I think it's very important we're utilize this opportunity of Shangri-La Dialogue and other opportunities of bilateral dialogue to create more guardrails, make sure that two sides obey the rules of the road.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brian, probably for people outside this region, people have less understanding of the Taiwan issue. For people in this region, they know that this is basically a legacy of the Chinese Civil War in the 1940s. Taiwan is part of China, and for regional countries, people have no problem with that. And how do they see this, tension created over across the Taiwan Straits, let's say?
I think it's divided, actually, because the US has a lot of influence in this region through media. They convince a lot of young people to kind of follow the narratives of the West versus the narratives and the interests of the people actually here in the region. I think it's interesting that your other guest was saying how the status quo is what is desired. Look at the polling in Taiwan, but isn't that what the United States does? It's not just disregarding China's sovereignty, but it's also disregarding the best interests of the people living in Taiwan. This is what they did to Ukraine. President Vladimir Zelensky, he was elected to bring peace to the Donbas region and create peace between Ukraine and Russia, and the US continued pressuring Ukraine down the path toward war. And this is exactly what they're doing in regards to Taiwan. The whole region sees this. I think at a government level, and people who are paying attention, they see this. And I don't know what the answer is to avoid it, but I think people realizing it and speaking up about it, I think that is the first step in not allowing the United States to push this narrative that they are defending national sovereignty, citing Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty while meddling in China's internal political affairs in regards to Taiwan. It's just blatant hypocrisy.
Mm-hmm. Well, Robert, as Zhao Hai said, President Biden basically earlier said that the U.S. would defend Taiwan against the Chinese mainland, by sending probably U.S. troops. Why the U.S. refused to get directly involved in the Ukraine war, and somehow U.S. is not afraid of sending troops to Taiwan to fight the Chinese? Both Russia and Chinese, they are nuclear powers.
Yeah, I actually find that rather surprising too. I think, first of all, I would say the United States is almost certainly not going to send ground troops to Taiwan. I would be shocked if that were to happen. The United States is not going to fight another land war in Asia. We're done doing that. It would be air and maritime. Increasingly, there's no upside to ambiguity on Taiwan, right? Increasingly, there's a perception that sort of being more open in the American defense commitment on Taiwan is important because it signals to other democracies in the region, to other players in the region who are concerned about China, specifically the Vietnamese and the Philippines and the South Koreans, that the United States is sort of going to stay, and the United States is actually willing to sort of slug it out if necessary with China. I'm a little bit worried about that. I've said this many times on your show. I actually think the United States, I think the status quo, strategic ambiguity, actually serves most parties reasonably well. It's not great for anybody, but it's a decent working compromise that protects us, that keeps us all from sliding towards a major conflict and towards a Cold War. But increasingly, the U.S. and China are just pulling apart. I mean, the differences are now growing and increasingly glaring, and I think both sides realize that, and there's just a pulling apart of the relationship, and it's very clear that's happening at the strategic level. It's going to infect the economic relationship. You're going to see economic decoupling over the next 20 years. It's going to get worse, and that's why it's great that the Chinese came to the Shangri-La Dialogue for the first time in like 12 years, because at least it means the defense ministers are talking. I mean, this is the first time that's happened in a while, because this is what we need to do. We need to keep talking at sort of like at the high level, because otherwise, at the middling level, things are really kind of pulling apart, and that's the threat, right? And that's the sort of the possibility that we're going to repeat the Cold War, which would be a disaster for everybody.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.